Tomorrow we'll be able to say we are still here, but he's gone. Yeah.
I mean, seriously, who can't get enough of that content right there? The pulling down of Christopher Columbus statues is literally something I could watch over and over and over again. Welcome to Burn It Down with Kim Brown, everybody. And on today's program, we are going to reach back, if we could, by about a week or two to Stir Crazy, when we have hosted conversations about Indian country and indigenous issues here in the U.S. every other Friday. Is called First Nation Friday. Well, today's going to be the last First Nation Friday. And as devastated as I am to tell you that, I am encouraged because we have a big announcement coming at the end of the show that we can't wait to tell you about, where you can get indigenous news. I'll give you a hint. But speaking of Indigenous news and Indigenous Peoples Day, which we celebrated on Monday, the entire week it has really illustrated how much Indian country still remains under tyranny, right? So, we're looking at Trump standing from, in front of the White House, bragging about how he sicked U.S. Marshals on an anti-fascist activist out in Portland and gloating about that. And people are talking about, oh my gosh, we live under tyranny. Native people have been living under tyranny for hundreds of years right here on this continent. And please don't think that the United States government has taken the flame down on tyranny against indigenous people. Not at all. Trump is just the latest tyrant. We can go back to Andrew Jackson, and before we can talk about Reagan, we talk about President Obama. But for Native people, it's really just one tyrant after the other. And that was on display this week in a number of ways. Border Patrol agents fired tear gas and other munitions at indigenous activists who are protecting sacred lands from border wall construction. We also have seen an issue that we're going to talk about coming from Canada and Nova Scotia, where Native people were attacked, Native lobstermen were attacked by literally a mob of angry white folks. And the RCMP did nothing. They stood there. We have a lot to get into, gang. But before we get all that, of course, for the final time on this program, at least, I'd like to introduce our illustrious panel of Indigenous writers and activists who have done a lot to open my eyes about the ongoing challenges and plights and nuances of Native American culture. So I'd like to welcome to the show Jen Deerinwater, Desiree Kane, and Johnny J. Thank y'all for being here on our final First Nation Fridays. It's sad, but I'm so happy to see y'all glowing faces.
Yeah, nice to see you.
Yep, exciting to be here.
As always.
And of course, guys, we have so many places we could literally start. But I think actually we should probably head down south to the Southwest, where several were arrested on Indigenous Peoples Day in Arizona. And it's the Toho, help me out with the pronunciation, ladies, if you would. Tohono. Thank you very much. We have some video that I want us to take a peek at there, Dwayne. Let's go to that first one that was on the Instagram account of Mexi Hakatzli. Again, I'm so horrible with pronunciations. But it says it's labeled Indigenous Peoples Day action gets met with tear gas from sheriffs. Let's take a look at that. v1.
You remember back in July, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that much of eastern Oklahoma is what's called Indian country under federal law. The immediate effect of that had to do.
That's not it. It was from Tuesdays. It's on the docket. It's labeled V1. It says Indigenous Peoples Day actions met with tear gas from sheriffs. I'll give you a second to catch up with that. But listen, in the interim, while we're waiting for that video to come out, we know that people were arrested at this Indigenous Peoples Day action. It was near this border checkpoint just west of Tucson. Desiree, you actually sent me the video that we're looking for right now from Instagram. What do you know about the actions that were taking place there and why the conflict came with Border Patrol agents?
I mean, the U.S. is illegally occupying unceded Tohono O'odham Treaty Territory. And so the community is clearly unhappy that a occupying force is in their life and disrupting their travel, disrupting their access to their families, something that has been going on for so long. I think people have just had enough. That's also what's happening with the Kumeyaay out in California with the border. Their nation is split. So they've got moms on one side and kids are on another side of the US-Mexico border, but they're from the same tribe and same family, and they didn't put that border wall there. So they're fighting for their human right of access and access to migration that is, there's no one standing in the way. Those communities have been traveling like that for millennia, and the last, couple hundred years, there's been an occupying force. As you move west, things are much more recent, whereas, some of the folks on the East Coast have had to deal with some of these issues much longer. So it's just a lot fresher when you start talking about tribes in the South and the Southwest.
Johnny,
but basically, the cops attacked them because they were just like, we want access to go visit our relatives like unmolested.
Perfectly reasonable and rational, especially if it's something that they've been doing for thousands of years, hundreds of years, predating Trump's bullshit border wall. Johnny J, it's like every single president has to take their turn trying to fuck over Indian country, right? And Trump's turn is, well, he's taken lots of turns, has he not? But this border wall is one of the most just grossest examples of like this manifest destiny. This man feels as if he has the right to throw this wall up on sacred lands that have not been ceded, and the environmental ramifications that come from doing that.
Absolutely. And it's not just that he's building a wall, but it's in the process of building that wall that he's destroying sacred sites. And he's also desecrating burial grounds that have belonged to the indigenous people of this land on both sides of the border since time immemorial. And, I think it was earlier this week that they announced that they had completed, I believe it was 360 miles of the border wall. And that's a lot of land, and that's it's just a lot of space that has just been decimated for this wall. And you have indigenous people on both sides of the border that have been greatly impacted by this. And, like Desiree was saying, we have tribes that have been split in half. One side exists on the one side of the border, the other on the other side. And, they were supposed to have a relationship, an agreement with the government that would allow them to be able to cross freely. But that has really been disrupted with this administration. And if you're living in one of those border towns and you're an indigenous person, you're going to have a story about having to interact with Border Patrol and them assuming that you're one of what they call an illegal. And I believe it was one of the speakers at this rally, was saying that there's a lot of solidarity among the tribes on both sides because they're just tired of having to fight for their rights, to the right to just exist on their homelands. And you think of I think it's really hard too, because when you really think of our political climate now, like we're just the militarization that is going on, the surveillance, it's not normal. And, a lot of people are just now starting to get upset with this. But if you're Native and you especially reside along the border, this is not new. This is something that you have dealt with for generations. It's just something that, is just there. And no matter how much you fight against it, it's not getting better, and our rights aren't being respected. In fact, every single administration that comes in, those rights get cut just a little bit more. And, these are unceded lands. That means there's no treaty rights. They have no right to these lands. They were not dominated. They were not won in a war. They were unceded. These lands still exist to these Native people. So it is really just angering that this is going on, but more so because, it just bugs me to no end right now, because, in the last couple of weeks, Trump has really been trying to court the Native vote and trying to say that he has done so much for Native people. And in fact, earlier this week, they also launched the Native Americans for Trump coalition, trying to grab that vote. But at the same time, you look at the reality of what he is doing to Native people. He has challenged federal recognition. He has tried to grab land. He has built this border destroying sites, building it without even getting environmental impact studies, and just forging ahead. And, there's so much violence that is going on. And so you kind of don't see what is happening to the Indigenous people and what they're dealing with. This is just one incident where they have been attacked. And, thankfully, because it's so normal now that the government is attacking U.S. citizens, police are attacking U.S. citizens for exercising their constitutionally protected rights, it's getting a little more leeway. But this has happened, not just now, but it's happened in the summer. It happened last year, and it's just happened the year before and the year before. But thankfully now, because it's just been so normalized and people are now outraged that it is happening, we're starting to see a little more of the impact that it's having for Native people. So that's the one good thing. But it's just terrible that it has to keep happening. And, again, when it comes up and it's against Indigenous people, it tends to be just an afterthought or just a little 30-second clip in the news, and nothing comes of it, because there's so many more egregious terrorist actions being taken against other U.S. citizens. So, it's just exhausting right now for Native people, to be honest. And, this border wall, we didn't put those borders there. They shouldn't be there. And, thankfully, there's that saying, you put the walls up and we're going to be the ones to tear it down. And that's absolutely true with Native people. And, we've seen it, I believe it was earlier this year, where the wind actually blew a huge portion of the wall down. And it was like, even Mother Nature thinks this is bullshit. So I really love that. And, these actions that Indigenous people are taking, it's not just happening on our side, it's both sides. And I'm really, just encouraged by that, because it shows that we're not going to stand down and just take this abuse any longer.
Mm-hmm. We actually have that video ready, gang. So I want us to take a look at a point of view perspective from one of the Indigenous land protectors out there in the Southwest. This was from Monday's action for the Indigenous Peoples Day that the Border Patrol showed up and started firing. Let's take a look.
Kick it back! Fuck it! Get it! Watch out! Wildfires! I can't.
And again, that was from the Instagram account of Mexi Halati. I think we can probably drop that credit maybe in the chat, somebody, just so I'm making sure that I'm crediting them perfectly or accurately. Jen, you know what that reminded me of? Scenes from Standing Rock and other places where Indigenous people have taken a physical stand against the law enforcement state of the United States. What are your thoughts about that crackdown on that protest from Monday?
It's not new. It's just, it's the same thing, different day, and I don't say that to, try to disparage what our people have gone through, are going through, but it's just another day for Natives in America, and I also want to say this kind of violence is similar for Indigenous people across the world. So it's not just, those of us considered American Indian. It's just a violence against Indigenous people really worldwide. There's a line in a song by, I think it's the Snotty Nose Res Kids, it says, all they see when they look at us is our land. And that's the reality. It doesn't matter which politician, which political party, which nation we're speaking of. All they see is our land, and they see the resources on it, and they are willing to do anything to get it because they're capitalist, white supremacist, greedy thugs. That is what a colonizer is. That's what the United States is. And that's what we've always known this. I think it's becoming more visible to the non-Indigenous world, but we Natives have always known this is the way since the white invasion began on our lands. And I think in particular on what's happening at the border for our Indigenous relatives down there, what's happening right now with Border Patrol and ICE, that's not new. We've had our children stolen from us through the boarding school system, which, we discussed, I think, on our last First Nation Fridays. We see our children being separated at the border, these detention centers. We know in Indian Health Services, many of our womb carriers had been sterilized against their will. We're seeing that happening, in the ICE system, in those detention centers. Like, it's just not new. And the violence that we're seeing there, it's also a violence against our women and girls and our two-spirits. There's a lot of sexual violence that's occurring for our Indigenous women, regardless of which side of the border they fall on, and for our girls. I remember learning years ago that some of the women who were making the journey across the border would go on birth control simply because they knew they were going to be raped along the way. And we have to think about the just devastating rates of sexual violence that Indigenous women in America still face. And I also think too, something that we should keep in mind with like the U.S., so-called U.S.-Mexico border is that we don't just have to be concerned about the American government. We have to be concerned about all those white nationalists out there who are, quote, patrolling and protecting the border. Think about the level of violence and intimidation and oppression they're bringing for our relatives down there. This is just, it's a lot. And it's just the non-Native control of Native lands and Native lives and bodies. And it's just another day for Indians in America,
We have to laugh from crying, do we not? It's so bad. And it's continuing to be bad. But Jen, you raise a very good point about the continued violence against Native bodies and Native lands. One move that happened in recent days came from Trump's Environmental Protection Agency, where somehow, in spite of the Supreme Court ruling, the McGirt decision, and let me credit all y'all because y'all told me over the summer when it happened, I'm like, oh, isn't this good news? Isn't this a great decision for Indian country in Oklahoma? And y'all were like, yeah, but no, because we have to watch this. We have watch for funny stuff, and the funny stuff has presented itself right now. EPA is telling the state of Oklahoma that they can still have control over tribal lands, environmental control over tribal lands, despite the McGirt decision. This is a pretty good package from KOCO, I believe, out of Oklahoma City. So let's take a look at that, kind of explaining what happened.
Yeah, remember back in July, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that much of eastern Oklahoma is what's called Indian country under federal law. The immediate effect of that had to do with many criminal cases within the Muskogee Creek Nation. But today's decision from the EPA underscores how much confusion there is ahead for the whole region. Tonight, the EPA telling Oklahoma in this letter that it can continue regulating environmental issues like fracking and hazardous waste, even on tribal land in eastern Oklahoma. There was speculation that after that landmark McGirt decision, the state may be limited in what powers it has on tribal land.
It moved from the state to the EPA on who regulates the environment. We wanted to protect the environment. It didn't expand. I believe we have to have one set of rules to be a healthy state with one set of regulations.
Some tribes speaking out against the EPA's decision today. Cherokee Nation Principal Chief Chuck Hoskin Jr. saying they asked for each tribe to be consulted individually about this, which he says didn't happen. He added, quote, all Oklahomans benefit when the tribes in the state work together in the spirit of mutual respect, and this knee-jerk reaction to curtail tribal jurisdiction is not productive.
That was Dylan Richards reporting from KOCO News 5 in Oklahoma. Now we have a pair of Oklahomans on the panel. And Jen, I know you're Cherokee. Johnny, I think you mentioned you're Cherokee also in part.
Choctaw and Otoe, Missouri, both from Oklahoma.
And not Cherokee. It's just Choctaw. Got it. So when you see this, I know you guys have already prepared yourselves in advance for something like this to come down the path, where a decision was made by the so-called highest court in the land, and yet here comes the federal government in conjunction with Governor Schitz. Isn't the name Governor Schitz from Oklahoma? Governor Schitz. Well, he's Governor Schitz on this program. So Governor Schitz and the federal government are tag teaming once again to deny Natives sovereignty over their own lands. Who wants to hop in on this one first?
Well, we said that when this ruling was passed down that we needed to watch out for other things, that it was going to start this kind of like domino effect of Oklahoma trying to grab back power in any way that they can. And this was one of the first ways that they were able to do it. But I think it's important to also note that this really isn't a new ruling. This was actually something that was done back in 2005, and it was a midnight rider that was attached to, I believe it was a transportation bill that took away environmental regulatory control of Oklahoma tribes if requested by the state, as it now does. And it was something that was slipped in there. And Oklahoma is very pro-fossil fuel, big oil, big agriculture, and they want to have access to native lands. They want to be able to do this. And some of the issues that Oklahoma face, it's not just fracking, it's not just the pipelines, it's hazardous waste dumping on tribal lands. When I was probably about 15, I was part of a great summer camp, and one of the issues that we tackled was the state of Oklahoma wanting to put hazardous I believe it was a uranium dump on some tribal lands that once housed the Chilocco Indian School. And it was a huge issue at the time because tribes were still trying to figure out what do we do with this land. And so, they really had to fight against that happening. And luckily they weren't, they were successful. But this is something that kind of led to that midnight rider, is it's where tribes were fighting for control of their land and were winning. And this midnight rider kind of helped, I guess, in Oklahoma's eyes, even the playing field a little to where they could have control if they requested it from the tribes and from the government, because the Supreme Court can nullify, or actually, I believe it's federal legislation can nullify Supreme Court rulings. So just because there is a Supreme Court ruling, and this is something we brought up with McGirt, it doesn't mean that legislation can't be passed that would nullify that ruling. And we see this happening already. And it is kind of terrifying because, we don't know which way this election is going to go. And, even if Biden wins, there's no guarantee that this isn't still going to be an issue that we're going to be facing under that administration as well, because they do not want natives to have autonomy. They don't want to recognize our sovereignty, especially when it comes to our land and the resources that we have. And to see this happening now is just terrifying, because Stitt is very anti-native, and this is largely in retaliation, not only for McGirt, but for a lot of tribes pushing back against him in trying to take more money from native tribes through trying to say that the gaming compacts were expired and that they had to enter into new agreements with the state of Oklahoma. So all of this is just retaliation on his part, trying to hit natives in any way that he can, throwing stones, just hoping that something hits. And it just happened. In this case, it did. And it's very terrifying because the impact of this is just huge. It's just terrible. It's exhausting.
Honey, I know. Jen, I wanted to get your take on this latest development as it pertains to Indigenous sovereignty in Oklahoma. But first, let me ask you a question. I mean, do tribes participate in fracking at all in Oklahoma, to your knowledge? I mean, are tribal lands being fracked with consent of the tribes or against their consent?
I feel like it's a bit of a mix, but yes, there are tribes that at this day are consenting to fossil fuel, development, if you want to call it that, extraction on the lands. I am staunchly against that, but I also believe in tribal sovereignty, and I believe that the only people who should make decisions about Native people are Native people. It should be our nations making those decisions. And then it's up to us as relatives within these tribal nations to hold our leaders accountable and make sure they do right by us. But then in terms of this whole EPA thing, I can say that all of the so-called 5 civilized tribes, which is, I hate that term so much. It's so condescending and racist. But the 5 civilized tribes are Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, which is my nation, Choctaw Nation, which is one of Johnny's, Chickasaw, Seminole, and who am I forgetting? Muskogee Creek. Like Muskogee Creek, the actual tribe in the McGirt case. It's been a long few weeks, folks. My brain is tired. Anyway, like our tribes immediately after the McGirt ruling started coming together and trying to figure out what are we going to do, because they knew the federal government would work with the state of Oklahoma to find some way to undermine McGirt. So there was a lot of back and forth internally amongst our people. Because we knew it was kind of like Johnny and Desiree and I after McGirt were like, yeah, that's great. We're glad the ruling went the way it went, but the government will find a way around it, because they always do, legal or illegal, and it'll mostly go unnoticed because the media doesn't typically report on Native people, which is part of what makes First Nation Fridays so special. But, it goes unchecked. And the thing that irritates me on top of that is that this idea that tribal nations are not capable of governing ourselves and the people residing on our lands. It's very paternalistic. It's just looking at us as if we are nothing but children, rather than the fact that we are nations who have been around since time immemorial. And I'm not saying it was a utopia, pre-white invasion, but we were doing a lot better, taking care of ourselves than we are now. And I look at Oklahoma, I was born in Tulsa. I lived in Tulsa County until I was 15. northeastern Oklahoma is where my tribe's land is, or at least where we were removed to. But, I look at Oklahoma, and the Oklahoma government has done an awful job of caring for all Oklahomans, native or otherwise. I look at what they've done to the land. Like, Oklahoma is now the most seismically active state in the continental U.S., and that is all because of fracking. I didn't grow up with earthquakes. I grew up with tornadoes and ice storms in really awful, hot, humid summers, but not earthquakes. I look at our educational system. Like pre-COVID, we had some school districts where kids were only going to school 4 days a week. And it was partially because of budgeting issues. Johnny brought up that it's not just the fracking. For those of us in Cherokee Nation, we now have problems with really big, like large-scale chicken farms coming in, polluting the water and the land. Oklahoma is now basically the prison and the pipeline capital of the world. It's just insulting that the federal government and the Oklahoma government somehow thinks that Oklahoma can do a better job at managing the land and the people when they have repeatedly failed every single Oklahoman. And the real kicker of it is that then the Governor Stitt and the other legislators have the audacity to demand money from us for gaming. Like, just how dare they? Cherokee Nation is providing jobs, not just to Cherokee Native people, but to non-Native people. They're picking up the slack on healthcare and education. They are coming in and doing what Oklahoma is just shown time and time again that it's not willing to do. So, yes, this is about the EPA and McGirt, but it's about so much more.
You subtract Native revenues from the state of Oklahoma, that bitch will collapse, okay? Real talk. And I say this as someone who reside in Tulsa, so I had an up close and personal experience with Oklahoma. It's a scary place, I'm trying to tell you, for Black and brown people. And again, Tulsa has a lot of historical Black history, but again, it's racist out there, and it's palpable, and it is still very much popping. They love the racisms out there in Oklahoma. Desiree, when we see the speed that it really took for the federal government and the state to hurry up, tag team against Indigenous sovereignty, and it's obviously not the first time that this has happened. What are the next steps? Do the Native tribes of Oklahoma need to go back to court? And I wanted to also highlight something that was pointed out in the clip, had to do with, I think, the statement from the chairman of the Cherokee Nation, when he said that he hoped that the EPA in the state of Oklahoma would have gone to each individual tribe and gotten them to come to a consensus. And that's not been the way that the United States deals with Native country. Not recognizing that these tribes are all sovereign, but instead dealing with Native Americans as a monolith.
That's, what they do, right? No nuance, no real understanding. What they do understand is the historical dynamic where Natives are forced to do whatever they want us to do, or our nations. They also participate in that divide and conquer thing where, there's a bad habit Americans have of playing any Indian will do. I don't know how else to word that, but it's basically like, if you don't like what the Native community is telling you about your actions, you just go find someone who agrees with you, because as in any diaspora, you can find someone who agrees with you. We have Natives who have viewpoints of across a diaspora of people. So I know that they understand that dynamic, that you can just pick and choose. That's what happens in the United States, is this like picking and choosing of whatever serves your individual desires, whims, or needs. You do it with culture. You see it on every level when it comes to Native, theft of Native culture, theft of Native land, that sort of thing. So I don't know, as I was sitting here listening to everyone talk, it just really struck me how there's a template that's used. And once you kind of see it playing out, it's pretty easy to identify, right? So the colonizer, they want the land, or they want some resource, or they want something. And in the case of fossil fuels, right? So they'll go and they'll bring their own scientists, and regardless of what Indigenous historians, maybe people who work with the land, work with the medicines, what the ecologists say, they're like, yeah, but our scientists that we paid say this. And so they create these panels where they're going to educate the community on such and such. It's the very old proselytization model of the churches and how you get into Native communities. So when you understand that the United States works on this model of how the Christian church proselytized on this continent and then forced Native people into believing in Christianity, it's the same. It's just taken it's like a different outfit on the same body, right? So I saw that going on in Guyana when Exxon was trying to win over the Amerindian, tribal chiefs for offshore drilling. And for some reason, they're able to control so much that the truth rarely, if ever, gets out about how damaging it is. I went down, as I guess a little bit of a tangent, but I had gone down to Guyana and gave a talk about what I had witnessed and what happened with me at Standing Rock. And you could see that even this very informed Native population, educated, their village chiefs called Tushaus, they had no idea that people were pulled out of sacred ceremony at gunpoint. They had no idea that sacred items had been urinated on by the police and then returned back. And so when I was telling them, this is what is coming, their eyes are really big, right? And for whatever reason, it's designed this way. There's very little memory around or communication to younger generations about how this template works, because it's been going and going and going. And it very much feels like there are these moments where we're like blindsided as a Native community, but then we're like, oh yeah, we know what this is. This always happens. But there's always that moment where we're like, oh, how could this be happening? And then we're like, oh yeah. And so Americans are just kind of starting to get hip to that. We're like, what's going on? Oh, wait. Yeah, that's the reality we live in. So like Jen said, just another day in Indian country.
Well, speaking of just another day in Indian country, a day does not go by without some white person trying to congratulate themselves for doing the absolute bare minimum when it comes to restoration of either sacred things particular to Indigenous people. And of course, Donald Trump is one of those, very much so. The kind of colonizer who, again, does the bare minimum and says he did a great job. So over 100 years ago, a European explorer, if we want to call it that, a raider, a thief, came to the U.S., went to Colorado, and in turn took 600 pieces of either native remains or artifacts and took them to Finland. And for reasons I don't quite understand, maybe someone in the chat could explain this to us, Finland did not want to give these items back until the Trump administration, they got together on some, white power collaborative, and Finland has decided to return now some of these items. They have already been repatriated back to some of the native peoples from the Mesa Verde region, but I think it originates in Colorado. But we have a clip kind of explaining what happened. Let's take a look at that.
In 1891, a young Finnish professor traveled to Mesa Verde in Colorado to study the cliff dwellings and returned to Finland, taking Native American artifacts and remains with him. Since then, they've been sitting in the National Museum of Finland.
We took them, the remains back on Saturday from Helsinki all the way to Mesa Verde.
But getting the artifacts and remains back to the U.S. wasn't easy. It took 70 years of negotiations between the two countries before President Trump and the president of Finland finally struck a deal last October.
They bonded very quickly, and everybody agreed that this was the time.
Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs Tara Sweeney says today was a solemn occasion.
The internment of human remains is culturally significant to Native American populations, regardless of where you are in the country.
Ambassador Pence says there still remains and other cultural artifacts in the Finnish museum. He says the White House is now working to bring them back home too.
You know, I at some point, I wish that Europeans would have a reckoning amongst themselves about this macabre practice of digging dead people up and fucking with their bones. I mean, they've done it in Africa, of course, Egypt, you know, the opening of the mummy. Leave the people alone. They are in their graves. And yet this practice was extremely common in North America from European settlers against indigenous sacred sites. And it's still happening. Even though this happened 130 years ago, it's still happening present day 2020. Desiree, this is in your neck of the woods. I wanted to get your take on this story.
Well, I'm thoroughly grossed out. Macabre is the right word. I suspect that practice maybe has some pagan roots in belief sets where you can get power, you know, from other people's things. But I don't appreciate the way that this is being used as bad pun coming. The Trump campaign and the Trump administration is literally throwing Native people a bone while raiding Native lands and like doing this massive power grab for resources across the continent, brutalizing Native folks, putting Native kids in cages. 1,400 of them have disappeared. Like, great. I'm appreciative that those remains are able to be rematriated back to this land. But I don't appreciate Trump using this as a messaging moment to try and win over Native American people. The right wing, the American government, I don't even know. Nobody seems to be an actual just friend to Native people. There's always some motive. There's always something going on. And if you go onto eBay right now, even with my own tribe, and you search California or Miwok trade beads, you will find where a grave robber went in and got beads that are put with bodies. And you can buy them. You can buy all kinds of things on eBay. It's like colonizer show and tell over there. It's really morbid. But so I'm just disturbed. I think that there is a big conversation that needs to happen with the museum systems in general, especially in Europe. But we can return some things to people and like it'll be okay. You're not going to lose, some sort of weird esoteric power that you believe come from little Indian kids' bones. Like, I don't know. I think it's gross. And it clearly needs to stop. But I think that Indian country, we need to recognize that the right wing is trying to radicalize Native people into the power structures of white supremacy. And it's through things like this that create even a tiny pathway to where Trump might seem like he's good when his genocide is real. They're playing with us. We are pawns. We are fodder as part of a means to an end, period. He doesn't give a shit. And so I have a hard time like exalting the guy in any way to be like, oh, thank you for giving us this smidgen while you actively kill our like Native children. F that. No, fuck that.
That's and Deerinwater. Baby, come on. Say what's on your chest. Say it with your chest. It's fine. You're in a safe space. Go ahead. But Jen, like I saw the story. I mean, granted, this story is a few weeks old, but if y'all could see the Trump press conference, like he was so giddy with himself. He really felt as if he had done something very significant for Native Americans. And I'm not here to minimize or diminish the return of ancestors' remains after being gone for over a century or more. Extremely important. However, that it does not do much in the way of policy that impacts Native people, unless he's going to go around to every single country in the globe that has stolen items from people from this continent, of Indigenous people native to this continent, but especially the remains. What are your thoughts?
I think it is ironic at best that a man who uses a Native child who was sex trafficked, raped and moved off to England against her will, using her as like a political prop while her remains still sit in the UK. And then he has the audacity to be like, look at me, I'm returning Native remains. It's just, for me, and I'm not saying he's a liberal, but it feels like the kind of nonsense that liberals do, where they're like, oh, look at what we did. We did something so great. And then they turn around and support someone like Biden, who's just a giant, piece of crap himself. You
have a teachable moment right here, because I did not know this. Pocahontas's remains are still over in the UK?
Yes.
They don't think that
says it all. Your face
they
says it
refuse
all.
to return her remains. Her relatives, her people have been trying forever to get her remains returned so that they can give them a proper burial. And the UK has just flat out denied that time and time again.
Something else that I recently learned that's on this topic of, Native remains and such is, so there's this really famous Native athlete, Jim Thorpe. He was in the first boarding school. It's a Carlisle Indian Industrial School, something like that. It's in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. He was one of the students there, and he just became a very well-known athlete. He was in the Olympics, all of these things. Well, I just recently did a little like mini trip getaway thing up in the Poconos and found out there is a town there named Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania. And so I had to know, like, how did this happen? And it turns out that his last wife that he had basically stole the remains from Jim Thorpe's people so that he couldn't be, buried properly and repatriated. And then she sold him off to this small town in Pennsylvania under the guise that they had to name it Jim Thorpe. And, it's like, this is so complex and ridiculous that I couldn't possibly say everything I think and feel in the 11 minutes we had left. But, even in death, we Native people cannot have peace. There is always some damn colonizer coming along, trying to unearth us, trying to keep us from our people, trying to hurt us, trying to use us as some political ploy. Even in death, we still don't get to have peace.
I mean, Johnny J., George Herbert Walker Bush was a powerful man. Perhaps we should run to Texas and dig him up and gain some sort of power from his bones. And,
it's so bad, but every Halloween or anytime, people start talking about Native burial grounds, I bring it up and I joke around that I'm just going to start going and robbing graveyards and digging up people's grandmas and being like, whoa, look, there's a white American princess. And it's so terrible that I joke about that. But, you get so frustrated and so angry because, like Jen said, like, even in death, we don't get rest. And, this is such a widespread problem that in 1990, they passed the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act because so many white people were just going to Native burial grounds and taking body parts. Just recently, there was an artist, I believe on Instagram, that was selling earrings and jewelry that were made from Native American teeth. And that's really disgusting. And, people are just so enthralled by this idea of like, oh, I'm going to wear Native people as jewelry. What the, I don't, I can't even wrap my head around that. But it's such a huge problem that they actually had to pass a law against this. And, this is where part of this return comes back because, this only applies to museums in the US. It doesn't apply to international entities, which is why it's taken so long for the return of these remains for the Hopi people to happen. And it's so angering that Trump is taking credit for it because the talks for this began in 2014. And the Hopi, the Acoma, they had people that have been working on this for such a long time. And it feels so gross that just because he is the one where, that they finally came to their senses, were like, okay, this is the right thing to do, that he gets to take credit for it. And like Desiree said, he gets to rub it in the face of Native people and be like, look what I did for you. And to rub it in the face of, non-Native supporters who don't know any better, who are going to look at it, but he's helping Native people. He returned these remains. No, he didn't. And, and honestly, I am not going to hold my breath on this until it happens, until those remains are returned and given back to the tribe. Until that happens, this is not a done deal, because we all know that when it comes to political dealings or deals or agreements, that they can easily be just discarded for whatever reason. Say Biden gets into office, maybe the agreement that he made with Finland is like, well, if I don't win this next election, well, then this is void. Maybe that's the agreement he made. We don't know, because nobody knows what this agreement is, just that he made an agreement that the remains will be returned. But it's so angering to me, especially now that it's, October and Halloween is just all around us. And this is the time when Natives really get hit hard from all sides with the ancient burial ground tropes, with, one of the Indian schools up in, I believe it's Minnesota, just put out a call for volunteers to keep ghost hunters from breaking into one of their abandoned residential Indian schools and doing investigations, because for some reason, white people are just so disrespectful to Indigenous people that they treat our deaths like a sideshow. They treat our remains like something that they can take and just show off to their friends. And this was brought up too in, I believe it was Rob Zombie's last movie, Free from Hell. And, there was a lot of Native stereotypical imagery used in this. And one of the things that just bugged me, but it was also really clever to me in the way that it kind of resonated with the whole story, was that they had an Indian skull on display. They had the headdress on display. And, they were bragging that this was taken from an Indian chief. This was taken from his graveyard. And it's like, that's what white people tend to do. They collect us. They want us on their shelves. They want to use our sacred ceremonial items as show and tell. And it's like Desiree said, it's just so macabre and just so frustrating that this is something that we still have to do with, because they wouldn't do that to their own grandma or grandpa. They wouldn't go raid their graves and put their skull on the mantle and be like, hey, look what I have, but it's okay to do it with Native people.
So just for the record, and you raise a really good point there, Johnny J, according to the Trump administration, this repatriation has already taken place as of maybe about a week ago. But we know Trump lies about everything. So I was trying to find some video, at least perhaps posted by one of the tribes who may have received back the remains of their ancestors. I was looking for one on YouTube. I could not find one. I really was looking for the voices of the tribes.
It hasn't happened yet. The tribes have just announced that they're going to be handling, I believe it was the chairman of the Hopi tribe just announced that his tribe is going to be the one to kind of take the lead on handling the return of those remains. The agreement has been made, but the actual exchange hasn't happened yet. So, you know, that's why I was saying, like, I honestly am not going to hold my breath on this happening until it does, because, you know, like you just said, Trump is a liar. He cannot tell the truth to save his life.
And I don't even know why Finland would even resist on this, but that's certainly another discussion, because we know how brutal Europe is, especially during the height of its imperialism to the native peoples around the globe that they affected. Guys, before we log off, there's another story I want us to get to, because, I mean, shoot, we talked about incidences pertaining to indigenous sovereignty at the border here in the mainland United States. So let's give Canada some too. We know Canada has been horrible to its First Nations people the whole time Canadians has been in existence. And just imagine if you are a native fisherman or a native lobsterman, and then all of a sudden you are encountered by a mob, an angry mob of white men being violent, talking shit. You would be concerned. Let's take a look at this clip from the CBC, The National. This is an incident that happened, I believe, just yesterday. Let's take a look.
It was perhaps the culmination of rising tension. The chief of the Sebeganegidi First Nation at the center of an altercation after a disturbing 24 hours.
People could have died last night, which is, somebody's going to be held accountable, and we'll be taking further action.
This is a mob of people terrorizing.
Last night, 200 non-Indigenous commercial fishermen gathered outside a lobster pound. It's where some Indigenous fishermen had been holding their catch.
Cops just sitting there while they take all these crates up.
This Indigenous fisherman says he barricaded himself inside.
They said they won't let me leave unless they have my lobsters.
While the group outside destroyed lobster, threw rocks,
Whoa, almost got me in the head with it.
and vandalized vehicles.
They slashed the tires. I watched one guy pee in the driver's seat of my truck.
The Sebeganegidi Band launched its own fishery outside the commercial season last month. The Supreme Court of Canada affirmed their right to fish for a moderate livelihood 21 years ago, but no rules were established as to how that should be implemented. That's led to standoffs on the wharf for weeks.
Our role essentially is try to keep the peace here.
But why has no one been arrested then?
We are taking the information and the evidence into account to make a judgment and a thorough investigation. We certainly don't go and arrest under emotion and for no reason at all.
But again, it seems that last night there were officers witnessing what you described as criminal activity, yet no arrests were made.
It's a measured approach.
By late this afternoon, a moment of calm.
Honestly. And if you want to reach out to me sometime and we can have a talk privately somewhere.
But still, the path to a resolution remains unclear. Kayla Hounsel, CBC News, Halifax.
Desiree Kane, thank you so much for bringing that story to my attention, because when I saw it, I said, well, let's do a little switcheroo here. Let's have a large group of Native men who are rowdy and violent surround and hold against their will two white Canadian fishermen. And do you think the Royal Canadian Mounted Police would have stood idly by and said that we don't make arrests based off feelings and we're here to maintain order? That was the biggest crock of shit I ever heard from that cop. And if you had any doubts as to whether or not cops are better in Canada, newsflash, they are not. Desiree, let me get your take on the incident that happened just last night in Halifax in Nova Scotia.
If the roles had been reversed, the RCMP would have just killed those two men right away. They would have just offed them, and then they would have forgiven the officers. You know, it's not like a kinder, gentler colonialism up in Canada. Right. So, you know, it's equally as ruthless. What I think is happening here that is really important to note is that what they're fighting over is 11 fishing licenses. And out of the main lobster fishery, there are 979 issued. That is the true scale of how things are. And they don't want Native people to have any sort of economic stability whatsoever. So, you know, heaven forbid that a tiny little band issue 11 fishing licenses when the government has said that they're allowed to do that as long as they don't generate too much wealth accumulation, because one of the uppity Indians over here. But this is a long-running conflict, but it's really about 11 licenses and 50 traps against 979 fishing licenses. So these roughly 1,000 fishermen are saying that it is entirely possible that 11 fishing licenses is going to destroy their industry, when you can see that the pandemic has impacted all of the seafood industry and trade from here to China. It's impacted. So I think this is the violence of inaction from RCMP that we're really keenly hip to in the United States, because we've watched over and over, and so have First Nations people, that the RCMP choosing not to act is equally as violent as taking a violent action, like aggressing towards the nation. They want compliant Indians, and the Native people are we've been fishing these waters for 1,500, 2,000, 10,000 millennia, and you want to control it. So we're going to work within your system, and we have our own fishery. That's what this band is saying. They're working within the rules. But right now out in Nova Scotia, it is white people mob rule with the police backing them against 11 fishing licenses. You ever see someone with a big, loud, polluting truck, and you're like, you, sir, are overcompensating for something? This feels like that.
Jen, Desiree raises a great point that the inaction on behalf of the RCMP in that situation is equally as violent as the actual violence that was being perpetrated by the white mob against these native lobster people. I mean, how many laws did we see broken just right then and there? Let's see, false imprisonment, robbery, stealing their product, vandalism, destruction of property, and the police did not. Exactly. Just the way that law enforcement on this continent, from Canada, US, Mexico, and even points further south, just allow violence to happen against Native people in plain view, in plain sight. And it's almost like the white pass. Well, this is white people doing this against Native people. We don't want to arrest Jim. We know Jim and his son. We go fishing with Jim. Tell me your thoughts about what we just saw.
It brought to mind some of the fishing treaty battles that our relatives up north on the US-Canadian border up in that area have had back in, I believe it was in the 70s in Wisconsin. Some of the tribes there started asserting their sovereign rights to their fishing by just going out and doing it. This was a protected right for them in their treaties, and they were met with just violent mobs of white men assaulting them, threatening them. And this went on for a long time. And it didn't matter if it was our men or our women going out to do the fishing. If you were a woman, you were getting hit with the violence too. In some cases, it seemed like it was significantly worse. But I mean, it's like Desiree said, they want compliant natives. They want us beaten down and broken and resourceless. And that's what it's always going to be. If we have money, if we have resources, if we have our land, if we have our sovereignty, then they can't kick us around anymore. And they don't want that. Let's be real. The white man meant for all of us to be dead. If the US had done what it was supposed to do, Johnny and Desiree and I would not be sitting here. If the previous colonizers had been successful in their mission to kill us off, we wouldn't be sitting here. Same thing up in Canada with the Miwok relatives is that, if the white man had done what they intended, we wouldn't even be sitting here right now. So of course, they're going to show up in mobs to try to keep Indigenous people from our sovereign rights and just our basic human right to exist and have a good, healthy life. You know, for me, it's in the inaction by the RCMP is absolutely a form of violence. You know, I think about it, you know, we've got that wonderful day of Thanksgiving coming up soon. And I mean, Thanksgiving is a holiday that was based around the Thanksgiving meals that happened after white colonizers went and, you know, burned villages to the ground and killed Native people. You know, the US didn't try to stop that. Instead, Lincoln said, well, you know, we got too many of these Thanksgiving meals, so let's just have one a year. We'll just do one. You know, like, it's still violence, you know, because this is what the state wants. And, you know, when Joe down the block does it rather than the government, like, it keeps the government's hands clean. It makes them look like they're not the genocidal monsters that they are.
Mm-hmm. Johnny J, your thoughts about the vintage racisms on display there in Nova Scotia, the angry white mob surrounding and intimidating and committing criminal acts against the brown people while the white law enforcement apparatus stands around and watch. We're lucky the RCMP wasn't involved, like, because they very easily could have been participating in those actions. So I guess thank goodness for small miracles. But what is your take on what the Native people there are dealing with pertaining to this issue?
Oh, this is one of those things that is going to have me dropping the F-bomb really quick, because can we also talk about the fucking irony of these people saying that this is about conservation and not racism, that they are attacking these Native fishermen? Because their whole thing, when they get on the news, they're saying this is about conservation. We have a lobster season for a reason. And like Desiree pointed out, they have over 900 fishing licenses, while the Native people have 11. That's not going to throw the ecosystem out of balance. It's just not possible. And if you're going to be worried about conservation, then you need to be reducing the number of licenses being given to non-Indigenous people that are responsible for overfishing and, you know, just decimating Native resources, not just for Native people, but for everyone. Because you look at the fishing industry now, and there are shortages on so many different fish, which is why the prices keep raising, because they overfish. And there's a lot of waste that happens. And yet it's not a concern when they're the ones doing it. But God forbid, small Native fisheries are allowed to fish out of season. It is not about conservation at all. And it's just so angering to me, because, you know, this is something that Indigenous people have to face all the time, because a lot of our communities are still rural. We often live in food deserts. So a lot of our communities do still rely on fishing, on hunting for food. And yet every single time that we exercise our rights to that, we have white people and vegans coming at us saying that we're destroying the ecosystem, that we're responsible for animal cruelty. And it's like, we're not the ones holding these huge, you know, agricultural businesses where they got chickens just packed in as much as possible and, you know, are just torturing these animals to fuel this industry. Like, Native people only hunt what we need. We use every part of the body. Nothing goes to waste when Indigenous people are using our resources, and we know how to use them. We have been responsible for those resources since time immemorial. We have had to steward those resources, and we know, you know, to keep a balance. Like, we know that there are certain times when you shouldn't fish this, or you shouldn't hunt this animal, because you need to allow that population to grow. Like, this is what Indigenous people just know inherently. But yet somehow when we exercise our rights that, you know, we have had since time immemorial, it's just white people lose their freaking minds. And they want to take that away from us and blame us for everything that they are responsible for. And I think a lot of it is just kind of to assuage their own guilt, because they know that they are responsible for, you know, the decimation of certain fish populations, of the endangerment of certain species. You look at climate change, that's something that their industries are also responsible for. But yet we always get the blame as Indigenous people. And it's just so angering to me, especially because the police officer that you saw in the video, Canada has this reputation of trying to be kind and more polite than Americans. And, if you had watched the longer video of this, he actually, I believe he said something along the lines of, we live in a country so great that people can criticize the police or criticize their inactions. And that was his whole response to people calling these officers out for just standing around. These two men that were locked inside that fishery could have died. What was keeping those people from setting that building on fire? They set their vehicle on fire. And, going back to conservation, in the process of it all, they destroyed what was brought in. They had the lobster out there and they were pouring chemicals on it, gasoline, and whatever they could to destroy the lobster so that it could not be used. And yet they're crying around about conservation. And it's just so angering to me because, Native people right now are getting hit so hard on so many different avenues. And only just these small glimpses, are getting gleaned up by the American public, by the Canadian public. And when it does, it comes back to this whole thing of victim shaming. We often get the blame for the violence that happens against us. And this is something that I've seen in comments from people responding to the First Nations people that, have been dealing with this firsthand. Is just people are, well, you shouldn't be out there fishing. You shouldn't do this. Maybe if your lives are threatened, you shouldn't be out there fishing. Maybe you should protect your own safety and just not do this or do this. And it's like, you know what? The real solution to this is that you guys just sit your asses down and leave us alone for a moment. I mean, that's the only real solution that there is. And like you can see, I'm kind of heated about this because, this is a small community. And like Desiree said, we're all getting hit by COVID, economically, physically, spiritually, mentally, we're all getting hit from all sides. But you don't see Native people running out and attacking white people for decimating our resources. You don't see us holding them hostage for, maybe looking at us the wrong way. But yet there you have white people out there carrying and just being awful human beings and using everything in the world as an excuse. And there's no justification for it. Like, it's just so but it's
so extra. It's just so extra.
White people are some delicate little flowers. Like, I don't even know sometimes. I'm saying that also as somebody who is part white and thinking about some of my own white family members and the things I grew up hearing them say, and just like, God, you people, what is wrong with you?
I know. And it's like, I kind of feel that after this year, whenever a person of color or someone from a marginalized community says that white people are the worst, they need to just shake our hand and be like, yes, we are. Because the proof is in the pudding. There are several videos. Like, we have a year worth of videos, day after day after day. Like, they just need to be like, yes, we are.
And then help us go collect their skin folk when people were problematic.
Mm-hmm.
Be that kind of white person that's like, oh man, white people are so problematic. But then when Karen that you went to high school with is all on some QAnon wild stuff, you go and you get them. Bring them back.
Please.
Yeah.
Guys, we have gone a bit into overtime. And before we sign off, as we said at the top of the show, this is going to be the last First Nation Friday here on Burn It Down, Kim Brown, but not to fret, because there is a new space, a new venue for everyone who wants to know the issues that are happening in Indian country, the challenges that Indian country still faces, and more importantly, the people who are doing the work for liberation, for land back, for all of that. So Desiree, I'm gonna let you tell the people what's happening here.
Oh, okay. So Jen, Johnny, and myself are going to be doing Decolonized News Hour. It will be news and commentary on current issues from a Native perspective. So you can expect Johnny and I to be co-hosting and producing. Jen is going to be your regular host, and we're going to be bringing in guests who provide the kind of commentary that you're used to. And then hopefully, we'll have some crossover with Kim. Maybe you'll come over to our show one time. I don't know. The future is ours, but there's never been anything like this before. There's never been a show with news and commentary by Native non-men where the Real News Network is really doing something very special by partnering with all of us to bring you some news. So hope that was a good intro, but I'm stoked. I'm so excited.
I am so excited. I feel like a kid. I can't contain the excitement. And like Desiree said, there hasn't been a show like this. I mean, we're looking at different podcasts and things, and there's just not like a regular news show that is hosted and produced by Indigenous women or Two-Spirits, let alone those of us who have disabilities and chronic illnesses. Like in general, just disabled and chronically ill people, we don't really hear from them as journalists, or from us, I should say, as a disabled person. So this is just all around a really groundbreaking show. Like we don't even have this kind of news show within Native media. So I'm excited. I can't wait. It's going to be bi-weekly. I can't recall if Desiree said that. Are we giving our launch date yet? Have we decided on that? No? Okay. All right. It's coming soon, though.
Just know it's coming soon.
Stay tuned. Follow us, and you'll stay in the loop.
Johnny J, I'll let you get the last comment, and then we're going to say good night.
Well, I'm really excited about this because, as they've been saying, this is a groundbreaking show, and I am so glad that we have such diverse voices and perspectives between the three of us, and that we're going to be able to provide perspectives that, most people aren't hearing. As Desiree mentioned, we have so many natives that have so many different perspectives, but yet when you think of Native American, we're just portrayed as this monolith. But we are so diverse in the way that we exist, the way that we think, the way that we create. So I'm really glad that we're going to be able to provide a platform to elevate those voices of Native people who just are never heard.
I am so excited for the three of you, and I'm so excited really for the Real News audience because I have gotten a lot out of First Nation Fridays. I really have. And I will absolutely admit that I have not kept up with the Native Indigenous struggle in the United States, not to the extent that I feel as if I probably should have, but because you all have been so gracious with your insights and your perspectives and your flaming hot takes about things, even intra-community issues with Indigenous folks, and the way that the ongoing struggle against the federal government, hundreds of years long now, it's still going. And everyone who watches the Real News, we need to know about this. We cannot expect liberation for our own respective marginalized groups until the Indigenous people of this continent get theirs. And whatever it takes to help them do that, if you consider yourself an ally of marginalized people, you better be about that Indigenous struggle as well. So tune in to the new show when it launches. Follow Jen, Johnny, and Desiree on Twitter, on their social media accounts, and follow us here at The Real News. We will absolutely keep you posted. Guys, that is the Friday edition of Burn It Down, Kim Brown. Thank you all for hanging out with us in overtime. Don't forget to like and subscribe on the YouTube channel. And we're going to say sayonara to First Nation Fridays. She was a good soldier, but there is something better coming to replace it. So thank you so much to Jen, Johnny, and Desiree for all that you do. And listen, y'all, we will see y'all on Tuesday for Burn It Down with Kim Brown. Have a great weekend.